The evacuation alarm screamed through the corridors of Station Omega-7, its red warning lights casting hellish shadows on the metal walls. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her back against the bulkhead, feeling the vibrations of enemy plasma fire eating through the outer hull. The Zephyrian attack fleet had come out of nowhere, their ships materializing from quantum fold space like deadly phantoms. "All hands, abandon station." "This is not a drill," echoed through the comm system, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was focused on something else entirely, the nursery section in Delta Wing, where the 5 young Draconian refugees had been placed under human protection just 3 weeks ago. The Draconians were an ancient species, proud and powerful, with scales that shimmered like precious metals and eyes that held the wisdom of millennia. But these 5 were different. They were younglings, barely past their hatching cycles, orphaned when their homeworld fell to the same Zephyrian forces now attacking the station. The Galactic Council had entrusted them to human care, believing that humanity's reputation for protecting the innocent would keep them safe. Sarah's tactical officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, grabbed her arm as she moved toward the inner corridors instead of the escape pods. "Captain, where are you going?" "The evacuation shuttles are this way." "The hatchlings," she said simply, checking her sidearm and emergency oxygen supply. "They're still in Delta Wing." Rodriguez's face went pale. "Captain, Delta Wing took a direct hit 5 minutes ago. The section is compromised, atmosphere venting, and the structural integrity is failing. It's suicide to go in there." Sarah looked at him with steady brown eyes. "Then it's suicide. Those children didn't ask to be here, Lieutenant. We promised their people we'd protect them." The station shuddered as another barrage hit, and Sarah could hear the groaning of twisted metal somewhere deep in the station's bones. Emergency lighting flickered, casting strange shadows that danced like ghosts in the smoke-filled corridors. She knew Rodriguez was right. Going into Delta Wing was almost certainly a death sentence. The Zephyrians were methodical in their destruction, and they showed no mercy to any species that stood against them. But Sarah also knew something else. She knew why humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but through something much simpler and infinitely more powerful. They were the species that ran toward danger when others ran away. They were the ones who said no when evil demanded surrender. "Go to the shuttles, Rodriguez." "That's an order." "With respect, Captain, I'm not leaving you here." Sarah smiled grimly. "I'm not asking you to leave me. I'm asking you to make sure those evacuation shuttles get clear. Someone needs to tell the Council what happened here. Someone needs to make sure those Zephyrian bastards pay for this." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment longer, then saluted sharply. "Yes, ma'am." "Give them hell, Captain." Sarah watched him disappear around the corner toward the evacuation bays, then turned and sprinted toward Delta Wing. The corridors grew darker and more damaged as she went deeper into the wounded station. Sparks showered from damaged lighting fixtures, and the air grew thin as life support systems failed one by one. She passed viewports that showed the battle raging outside. Human defense ships darted between the massive Zephyrian dreadnoughts like angry wasps, their weapons scoring bright lines across enemy hulls. But there were too many attackers, and humanity's forces were being steadily overwhelmed. The station was lost, and everyone knew it. Sarah reached the entrance to Delta Wing and stopped cold. The blast doors were sealed, warning lights flashing urgent red warnings about atmosphere loss and radiation leakage. Her wrist computer confirmed what she already suspected. The section was compromised beyond repair, with maybe 10 minutes before complete structural collapse. She overrode the blast doors with her command codes and stepped through into hell. The corridor beyond was a twisted wreck of metal and sparking electronics. The artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, making her stumble as she navigated around debris. Somewhere ahead she could hear something that made her heart race, the sound of young Draconian voices calling for help. Sarah quickened her pace, her emergency respirator working overtime to filter the toxic smoke filling the air. The nursery was just ahead, past 2 more sealed compartments and around a corner where the hull breach was spreading like a cancer through the station's superstructure. As she ran, Sarah thought about her daughter back on Earth, safe in her grandmother's care while Mommy fought the monsters among the stars. She thought about the promise she'd made to the Draconian elder, who had entrusted these young ones to human protection. Most of all, She thought about what it meant to be human in a universe that often seemed designed to crush the spirit of anyone who dared to care about anything beyond their own survival. The nursery doors came into view, twisted but still intact. Sarah could see emergency lighting still functioning inside, and her heart leaped when she heard the distinctive chittering sounds that young draconians made when they were frightened but alive. She was almost there. Sarah forced open the nursery doors, her muscles straining against the warped metal frame. The sight that greeted her inside made her heart clench. The 5 young draconians were huddled together in the center of the room, their scales dulled with fear and stress. The largest, a female named Zara, who couldn't be more than 50 years old in draconian terms, barely a child, had spread her wings protectively over the 4 smaller ones. Captain Chen. Zara's voice carried the musical quality of her species, but it was tight with terror. We thought everyone had left us. Never, Sarah said firmly, crossing to them quickly. I promised your people I'd keep you safe, and humans keep their promises. The nursery was a disaster zone. One wall had been blown open to space, sealed only by emergency force fields that flickered ominously. The artificial gravity was failing, causing toys and furniture to float eerily around the room. Worst of all, Sarah's scanner showed massive structural damage spreading throughout this entire section of the station. They had maybe 5 minutes before this compartment joined the void. The youngest draconian, a male called Pip who was barely larger than a human toddler, whimpered and pressed closer to Sarah's leg. His scales, normally a brilliant emerald, had faded to a sickly gray with fear. Are the bad ships going to hurt us? Sarah knelt down to his level, her voice gentle despite the chaos around them. Not if I have anything to say about it, little one. She quickly assessed the situation. 5 young draconians, each weighing between 30 and 60 pounds. The eldest, Zara, might be able to fly short distances, but the others were too young, their wing muscles not yet developed enough for sustained flight. The emergency evacuation pods for this section had been destroyed in the initial attack, and the main corridors leading back to the evacuation bays were rapidly becoming impassable. But Sarah had noticed something during her desperate run through Delta Wing, an emergency maintenance shaft that led to the secondary hangar bay. It would be a dangerous journey through narrow, unventilated spaces, but it might be their only chance. Listen to me carefully, she told the young draconians, gathering them closer. We're going to play a game called Follow the Captain. I'm going to lead you through some tight spaces to get to safety, but you have to do exactly what I say when I say it. Can you do that? 4 small heads nodded solemnly, but little Pip began to cry, his tears leaving silver tracks down his scaled cheeks. I'm scared. I want my mama. Sarah's heart broke a little, but she kept her voice steady. I know you're scared, Pip. Being scared is okay. But being scared doesn't mean we give up. It means we help each other be brave. Zara, showing wisdom beyond her years, spread one wing over Pip comfortingly. The captain saved us once already, little brother. She won't let anything happen to us now. Sarah was touched by the young female's faith, but she knew the terrifying truth. The maintenance shaft was barely wide enough for an adult human, partially collapsed in places, and led through sections of the station that were rapidly losing life support. Even if she could get the hatchlings through it, there was no guarantee that the secondary hangar bay would still be functional when they arrived. Another explosion rocked the station, and Sarah watched cracks spread across the viewport that looked out into space. Time was running out faster than she'd hoped. Okay, everyone, she said, standing and checking her equipment. Zara, you're going to help me lead the others. The rest of you hold hands and stay close. We're going to crawl through a special tunnel that will take us to the ships. She pried open the maintenance access panel, revealing a narrow shaft that stretched away into darkness. Sarah's claustrophobia kicked in immediately. The space was barely large enough for her to crawl through, and with 5 young draconians following behind, it would be a nightmare journey. But as she looked back at the 5 frightened faces watching her with complete trust, Sarah felt something ignite in her chest. It was the same feeling that had driven humanity to the stars in the first place, the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had earned her species the grudging respect of older galactic civilizations. In we go, she said, pulling herself into the shaft. Remember, stay close and do exactly what I say. Sarah began crawling through the narrow tunnel, her emergency light cutting through the darkness ahead. Behind her, she could hear the young draconians following, their claws clicking softly on the metal surface. The shaft was hot, filled with the acrid smell of burning electronics and the metallic taste of recycled air. As they moved deeper into the station's infrastructure, Sarah could hear the battle raging outside. Plasma fire lit up the darkness beyond occasional grating, and she could feel the vibrations of weapons impacts transmitted through the station's superstructure. The Zephyrians were being systematic in their destruction, methodically tearing apart humanity's stronghold in this sector. Halfway through the shaft, disaster struck. A massive explosion somewhere nearby sent a shockwave through the station, and Sarah heard the terrible sound of metal giving way. Behind her, little Pip cried out in terror as part of the tunnel collapsed, blocking their retreat. They were committed now. The only way was forward, through a route that might already be compromised, toward a destination that might not exist anymore. But Sarah kept crawling, kept moving, because stopping meant death for all of them. The maintenance shaft grew increasingly treacherous as they progressed. Sarah's shoulders ached from crawling through the narrow space, and her emergency oxygen supply was running lower than she'd like. Behind her, the young Draconians were beginning to tire, their breathing becoming labored in the thin, toxic air, Captain, Zara whispered, her voice strained. Keth is having trouble breathing. Sarah looked back to see one of the middle younglings, a bronze-scaled male struggling with each breath. His scales had turned an alarming pale color, and his eyes were beginning to glaze over. Carbon dioxide poisoning, Sarah realized with growing horror. The emergency atmosphere recyclers in this section had failed, and the air was becoming lethal. Hold on, Keth, Sarah called softly. We're almost there. It was a lie. They were barely halfway to the secondary hangar, and Sarah's scanner was showing multiple system failures throughout the route ahead. But sometimes a lie told with enough conviction could become truth through sheer force of will. Sarah increased her pace, ignoring the pain in her knees and shoulders as sharp metal edges tore at her uniform. Behind her, she could hear little Pip beginning to cry again, and the sound cut through her like a blade. These children had survived the destruction of their homeworld, had traveled across the galaxy to find safety under human protection, and now they were going to die in a maintenance tunnel because she couldn't move fast enough. That thought lit a fire in Sarah's chest. She pushed harder, faster, driving herself beyond normal human endurance. Her species hadn't conquered the stars through superior technology or natural gifts. They'd done it through stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to quit when things got impossible. A junction appeared ahead, 3 tunnels branching off in different directions. Sarah's scanner flickered and died, its electronics finally succumbing to the radiation and electromagnetic interference flooding the station. She was navigating by memory now, trying to recall the station blueprints she'd studied years ago during her first assignment here. Middle passage, she decided, following what she hoped was the correct route toward the secondary hangar. The shaft here was even narrower, barely wide enough for her body, and she could hear the young Draconians struggling to fit their wing joints through the tight space. I can't fit, one of them cried out in panic. It was Vel, a red-scaled female whose wings were slightly larger than the others. My wings are stuck. Sarah stopped, her heart pounding. If they couldn't all fit through this section, she'd have to make an impossible choice, continue with some and leave others behind, or find another route that might not exist. Zara, she called back, can you help Vel fold her wings tighter? Remember how your flight instructor taught you to compress for landing? There was a moment of struggle and whispered encouragement, then Vel's relieved voice. I did it. I can move again. They pressed on through the narrowing tunnel, and Sarah began to smell something that made her heart leap. The distinctive ozone scent of a functioning hangar bay atmosphere system. They were getting close, but their luck couldn't hold forever. As they approached what Sarah hoped was the final junction before the hangar access, another massive explosion rocked the station. This one was different, bigger, and Sarah felt a terrible certainty that the Zephyrians had just destroyed the main reactor. The lights went out completely, leaving them in absolute darkness save for Sarah's failing emergency beam. Worse, she could feel the artificial gravity beginning to fluctuate wildly. As the station's power grid collapsed, loose debris in the tunnel began floating around them, creating a deadly obstacle course in the darkness. Captain, Pip's voice was high with terror. I can't see anything. It's okay, Sarah said, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs. Just follow my voice. We're almost there. She could hear the young Draconians whimpering behind her, their natural night vision overwhelmed by the complete absence of light. But they kept following, kept crawling forward through the darkness, because they trusted her to lead them to safety. Sarah's hand suddenly encountered empty air, and she realized they'd reached the hangar access. She pulled herself up into a larger maintenance bay, then turned to help the younglings climb up behind her. One by one, she pulled them up from the tunnel. Zara first, then Keth, who was barely conscious from oxygen deprivation, then Vel and Drex, and finally little Pip, who clung to her like a lifeline. They were all through, all alive, but Sarah knew their trials were far from over. She could hear the sounds of the secondary hangar beyond the final access hatch, but she could also hear the distinctive whine of Zephyrian boarding craft. The enemy had reached the hangar before them. Sarah checked her sidearm and looked at the 5 exhausted, frightened faces depending on her. The younglings were at the edge of collapse, barely able to continue, but the alternative was surrender to a species that showed no mercy to prisoners. "One more push," she told them quietly. "Just one more and we'll be safe." As she prepared to open the final hatch, Sarah wondered if she was leading them to safety or to their deaths. But that was a question for later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was moving forward, because stopping meant giving up, and humans never gave up. Sarah pressed her ear to the final access hatch, listening to the sounds beyond. The secondary hangar bay was active, but not in the way she'd hoped. The rhythmic thunder of Zephyrian boarding craft engines mixed with the distinctive crack of plasma weapons and human return fire. The enemy had beaten them here. "Stay very quiet," she whispered to the young Draconians who huddled close together in the cramped maintenance bay. "There are bad people in the next room, but we're going to get past them." Zara's eyes were wide with exhaustion and fear, but she nodded bravely. "What do we do, Captain?" Sarah peered through a maintenance grating into the hangar bay beyond. The scene was chaos. Zephyrian soldiers in their distinctive black armor were advancing across the hangar floor, their weapons cutting down the few human personnel who hadn't made it to the evacuation shuttles. But Sarah's heart leaped when she spotted a small emergency transport still sitting in Launch Bay 3, apparently overlooked in the confusion. The problem was getting to it. 50 meters of open hangar floor lay between their hiding spot and the transport, and the space was crawling with enemy soldiers. Even if she could somehow reach the ship, there was no guarantee it would still be functional, or that she could pilot it with 5 traumatized younglings aboard. But as Sarah watched, something remarkable happened. From concealed positions around the hangar, human maintenance crew members and security personnel began emerging to attack the Zephyrian forces. They were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with desperate courage, trying to buy time for any remaining evacuees. Chief Petty Officer Martinez, a grizzled veteran Sarah had served with for 3 years, popped up from behind a fuel tank and laid down covering fire with an assault rifle. Ensign Kim, barely out of the academy, charged a Zephyrian squad with nothing but a plasma cutter and unlimited fury. They were fighting a hopeless battle, but they were fighting it anyway because that's what humans did. Sarah made her decision. She couldn't let their sacrifice be meaningless. "Listen carefully," she told the young Draconians. "I'm going to create a distraction. When I tell you to run, you go straight to that small ship in the corner. Don't look back, don't stop for anything. Zara, you're in charge. Get everyone inside and wait for me." "What about you?" little Pip asked, his voice trembling. Sarah smiled and ruffled his scaled head gently. "I'll be right behind you. I promise." Another lie told with conviction, but sometimes that was all you had. Sarah checked her weapon and prepared to open the hatch. She had one plasma pistol with a nearly drained power cell, no backup and no plan beyond running toward danger, and hoping courage would be enough. It wasn't much, but it was what humans had always worked with. She burst through the hatch and immediately drew fire from 3 Zephyrian soldiers. Their plasma bolts sizzled past her as she rolled behind a cargo container, her own return fire dropping one of the aliens. The distinctive crack hiss of Zephyrian weapons filled the air around her, as more enemies turned their attention to this new threat. "Now," she shouted to the younglings. "Run!" Sarah saw them emerge from the maintenance hatch in her peripheral vision. 5 small forms racing across the hangar floor toward the emergency transport. Zara led them with surprising speed and determination. Her wings spread slightly for balance as she guided the others around debris and wreckage. But the Zephyrians had spotted them too. 2 soldiers turned their weapons toward the fleeing younglings, their alien faces showing no emotion as they prepared to cut down children. Sarah's world narrowed to a single moment of crystalline clarity. She could stay in cover and maybe survive a few minutes longer. Or she could do what humans had always done when innocent lives were at stake. She charged. Sprinting across open ground under enemy fire, Sarah screamed a wordless battle cry that echoed off the hangar walls. Her plasma pistol bucked in her hands as she fired rapidly, forcing the Zephyrians to take cover instead of shooting at the younglings. Alien return fire scorched the air around her, so close she could smell the ozone discharge. One plasma bolt grazed her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her stumbling. Another burnt through her uniform sleeve, leaving a line of seared fabric and skin. But she kept running, kept firing, because every second she drew their attention was another second for the younglings to reach safety. Sarah reached the transport just as Zara was helping Pip climb through the access hatch. The young female Draconian looked back at her with gratitude and terror. "Captain, you're hurt." "I'm fine," Sarah gasped, pushing the last youngling inside and sealing the hatch. "Everyone strap in." She threw herself into the pilot's seat and began the emergency startup sequence, her hands flying over unfamiliar controls. This was a maintenance transport, not a fighter craft, but it had basic engines and life support. That would have to be enough. The hangar's launch bay doors were already open, revealing the star-filled void beyond. But between them and escape, Zephyrian boarding craft were beginning to turn their weapons toward the small transport. Sarah's scanner showed at least 6 enemy ships moving to intercept them. As the transport's engines finally came online, Sarah looked back at the 5 young faces depending on her. They had made it this far through courage, luck, and sheer human stubbornness. Now came the hardest part, getting them safely away from a station that was dying around them, through an enemy fleet that outnumbered them 100 to 1. The emergency transport lurched forward as Sarah gunned the engines, shooting out of the hangar bay into the star-filled battlefield beyond. Immediately, plasma fire lit up space around them as Zephyrian interceptors moved to block their escape route. The little transport shuddered under near misses, its hull groaning with stress it was never designed to handle. "Hold on," Sarah shouted, throwing the ship into a desperate evasive pattern. Behind her, the 5 young Draconians were strapped into cargo harnesses, their eyes wide with terror as they experienced combat for the first time in their young lives. Through the viewport, Sarah could see the larger battle still raging. Human defense ships darted between massive Zephyrian dreadnoughts like minnows attacking whales, their weapons carving bright lines across enemy hulls. But the human forces were clearly losing, falling back toward the inner system as their numbers dwindled. A Zephyrian interceptor swooped in from starboard, its weapons charging for a killing shot. Sarah yanked the transport into a sharp dive, using a piece of station debris as cover. The enemy plasma burst vaporized the wreckage where they'd been a second before. "Captain," Zara called out over the sound of straining engines. "Where are we going?" Sarah wished she had a good answer. The transport's fuel was limited, its weapons non-existent, and its life support systems were already showing strain from supporting 6 beings instead of the designed maximum of 3. Every human evacuation point would be compromised by now, and running randomly into space would just delay the inevitable. But then Sarah remembered something from her academy, training, a lesson about emergency protocols and hidden supply caches. Scattered throughout the outer rim, there was a depot in this system, hidden in the asteroid belt, maintained by humans for exactly this kind of disaster, if they could reach it. Sarah plotted a course through the debris field surrounding the dying station, using the wreckage as cover from enemy sensors. The transport was small enough and quiet enough that they might be able to slip past the Zephyrian perimeter, if she could avoid the patrol ships long enough. A massive explosion lit up space behind them as Station Omega-7's reactor finally went critical. The shockwave caught their little ship and sent them tumbling, alarms blaring as systems strained to their limits. Sarah fought to regain control, her hands flying over the stabilizer controls as the stars spun crazily outside the viewport. Little Pip was crying again, but quietly now, with the exhausted tears of a child who had been pushed beyond his limits. The other younglings tried to comfort him, their natural draconian protectiveness overcoming their own fear. "It's okay, little brother," Drex whispered, his bronze scales now shimmering with the stress patterns that marked deep trauma. "The captain will keep us safe." Sarah's heart clenched at the absolute trust in his voice. These children had every reason to give up hope, Their homeworld destroyed, their protectors killed or scattered, their refuge station burning behind them. But they still believed that somehow she would find a way to save them. She couldn't let them down. The transport cleared the debris field and entered open space, but Sarah's relief was short-lived. Her scanner lit up with contact warnings as Zephyrian patrol ships began converging on their position. The enemy had detected them, and their small head start was rapidly disappearing. "Attention, human vessel," came a cold voice over the communication channel. "Surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will result in your destruction." Sarah didn't even consider responding. Instead, she pushed the transport's engines beyond their safety limits, coaxing every bit of speed from the small craft. The asteroid belt was still 2 hours away at maximum burn, and they had maybe half that time before the enemy interceptors caught up. Behind her, Zara spoke up in a voice that was surprisingly steady for someone so young. "Captain, in our homeworld's ancient stories, there were humans who fought alongside our people against the darkness between the stars. They said humans had a special fire inside them, one that burned brightest when everything seemed lost." Sarah glanced back at the young draconian female, struck by the wisdom in her golden eyes. "Your people told stories about humans? Old stories from when our species first met yours. They said humans were the ones who ran toward the sound of battle when everyone else ran away. They said you were the people who kept your promises even when it cost everything." Another plasma burst from a pursuing interceptor lit up space nearby, close enough that Sarah could feel the heat through the transport's inadequate shielding. But somehow Zara's words steadied her, reminded her of what it meant to be human among the stars. They weren't the strongest species in the galaxy, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. But they were the ones who said no to evil when everyone else said maybe later. They were the ones who kept fighting when the odds were impossible, who protected the innocent even when it meant risking everything. Sarah Chen was carrying 5 young draconians toward uncertain safety through a field of enemies that wanted them dead. The smart play was to surrender, to hope for mercy from a species that had never shown any. But Sarah wasn't feeling smart. She was feeling human. "Hold on," she told her passengers, pushing the engines even harder. "We're going to make those interceptors work for their kill." The chase through the asteroid belt became a deadly game of 3-dimensional hide-and-seek. Sarah piloted the transport between massive tumbling rocks, using their bulk to break sensor locks and evade the pursuing Zephyrian interceptors. The little ship groaned with each sharp maneuver, its hull stressed far beyond design specifications. "Contact lost," Sarah heard over the enemy communication channel and allowed herself a moment of hope. But it was short-lived. The Zephyrians were spreading out using a search pattern that would systematically eliminate hiding places throughout the belt. "Captain," Vel spoke up hesitantly, "my people have enhanced hearing. I can hear their engine signatures even when they're behind the asteroids." Sarah looked back at the red-scaled youngling with surprise and growing excitement. "You can track them by sound?" Vel nodded, her large eyes reflecting the dim light from the transport's instruments. "There are 4 ships still hunting us. 2 moving around the big asteroid to our left, 1 coming over the top of the cluster ahead, and 1... She paused, tilting her head with the intense concentration of a predator listening for prey. "1 is trying to circle behind us." It was better intelligence than Sarah's damaged sensors could provide. "Can you guide me away from them?" For the next 20 minutes, Vel became their navigator, her sensitive hearing tracking the Zephyrian hunters while Sarah piloted through the maze of tumbling rock. The young draconian's directions were precise and confident, her natural abilities allowing them to stay 1 step ahead of discovery. But their luck couldn't last forever. The transport's fuel reserves were dropping rapidly. The engines were overheating, and Sarah's scanner showed that they were still hours away from the hidden supply depot. Worse, the Zephyrians were adapting to their tactics, tightening the search grid with methodical patience. Then little Pip made a discovery that changed everything. "Captain," he said in a small voice, "what are those lights?" Sarah followed his pointing claw and saw something that made her heart race. Spread across several asteroids were the faint running lights of hidden installations. Not human installations, but something much older and more mysterious. The lights formed patterns she recognized from xenoarchaeology textbooks, symbols of the precursors, the ancient race that had vanished from the galaxy millions of years ago. The Draconians saw them too, and their reaction was immediate and profound. All 5 younglings sat up straighter, their scales beginning to shimmer with excitement and what looked like recognition. "The Sanctuary of Echoes," Zara whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's real." Sarah looked at her in confusion. "You know what that is?" "Ancient stories from our homeworld," Zara explained, her eyes locked on the precursor structures. "A place where the first builders left gifts for the young races, where those who protect the innocent could find help when all hope was lost." Sarah's pragmatic mind rebelled against trusting ancient legends, but her scanner was detecting something extraordinary. The precursor installations were emitting energy signatures that suggested they were still functional after millions of years. And more importantly, they were generating some kind of interference field that was scrambling the Zephyrian sensors. "The stories say that only those with pure intentions can activate the sanctuary," Drex added, his voice hushed with reverence. "Those who risk everything for others, who keep their promises even unto death." A Zephyrian interceptor passed close to their hiding spot, its sensors sweeping blindly through the precursor interference. Sarah watched it move away, unable to detect them despite being close enough to see with the naked eye. Sarah made a decision that went against everything she'd learned about sticking to known technology and proven methods. She piloted the transport toward the largest of the precursor installations, following an approach vector that felt right rather than following any logical protocol. As they drew closer, the ancient structures began to respond. Lights that had been dormant for eons flickered to life, forming patterns that seemed to welcome them. The transport's engines, which had been overheating and failing, suddenly ran smoother and cooler. The life support systems, stretched beyond their limits, began functioning efficiently again. "How is this possible?" Sarah whispered, checking her instruments with disbelief. "The first builders understood something about the galaxy that younger races have forgotten," Zara said softly. "They knew that courage and compassion are forces as real as gravity or electromagnetism. They built their technology to respond to those qualities." The transport settled gently into a docking bay that hadn't seen use since before human civilization began. As they disembarked, Sarah found herself in a vast chamber filled with crystalline structures that hummed with barely contained energy. The younglings moved forward with instinctive confidence, as if they belonged here. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal holding what looked like a communication device of impossible complexity. When Zara approached it, the crystals began to sing in harmonies that made Sarah's bones vibrate with recognition and hope. "The message is being sent," Zara said, tears streaming down her scaled cheeks. "To every ship in the galaxy, every world, every space station. It's telling them what happened here, what the Zephyrians have done, and why the young races must stand together." Through the chamber's transparent walls, Sarah could see the precursor installations throughout the asteroid field coming to life, their ancient power building toward something magnificent and terrible. The Zephyrian ships, caught in the growing energy field, were being pushed away by forces they couldn't understand or resist. But more than that, Sarah could see new contacts appearing on her scanner. Ships were arriving in response to the sanctuary's call. Draconian vessels, human reinforcements, even ships from species she didn't recognize. The message was spreading across subspace faster than light itself, rallying everyone who believed that protecting the innocent was worth any sacrifice. The cavalry was coming, drawn by an ancient beacon that responded only to the purest human impulse, the willingness to risk everything for those who could not protect themselves. 6 months after the Sanctuary of Echoes sent its call across the galaxy, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the new Omega station, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on humanity's newest and most advanced deep space facility. The original station had been rebuilt from the ground up, but this time with help from a dozen different species who had answered the precursor beacon's call. Beside her, 5 young Draconians watched the work with interest and excitement. They were no longer the terrified hatchlings she had carried through burning corridors and maintenance shafts. Zara had grown into her role as a leader among her people, her scales now bearing the distinctive golden markings of a Draconian diplomat. The others had thrived as well, their natural abilities enhanced by the trauma they had survived and overcome. "Captain Chen," Zara said formally, though her eyes sparkled with warmth, "the Galactic Council has reached their decision about the Zephyrian homeworld." Sarah nodded. The aftermath of the Sanctuary's call had been swift and decisive. When the galaxy learned what the Zephyrians had done, destroying a homeworld, attacking innocent refugees, targeting children, the response had been immediate and overwhelming. Species that had never worked together before united in their outrage, and the Zephyrian Empire found itself facing an alliance that spanned half the galaxy. Complete embargo, Sarah guessed. No trade, no communication, no diplomatic recognition, until they make reparations and surrender their war criminals for trial. Better than that, little Pip said, though he wasn't so little anymore. His emerald scales now carried the bright patterns of a healthy, happy young draconian. They're going to be required to help rebuild what they destroyed, including our homeworld. Sarah smiled at the justice of it. The Zephyrians had spent so much effort conquering and destroying that they had forgotten how to create. Now they would learn, whether they wanted to or not. Through the observation deck's windows, Sarah could see ships from dozens of species working together on the construction project. Human engineering teams worked alongside draconian metallurgists, while insectoid Vorthak provided their incredible precision welding services. The unity that the sanctuary's call had awakened was proving to be more durable than anyone had expected. "There's something else," Drek said, his bronze scales shimmering with excitement. "The archaeological expedition to the sanctuary found something incredible." Sarah raised an eyebrow. The precursor installation in the asteroid belt had become the focus of intensive study from the galaxy's best xenoarchaeologists and historians. Every day brought new discoveries about the ancient race that had vanished long before younger civilizations had reached the stars. They found records, Vel continued, her red scales bright with enthusiasm. The precursors didn't disappear. They evolved beyond physical existence, but they left behind their technology for us to find when we were ready. "Ready for what?" Sarah asked. "To prove that we could put compassion above conquest," Zara said softly. "To show that we could risk everything for strangers, that we could work together instead of fighting over scraps. They were waiting for us to grow up." Sarah thought about that as she watched the construction continuing below. Humanity had spent centuries fighting its way to the stars, earning respect through stubborn courage and an absolute refusal to abandon those who needed protection. They had been the species that said no to evil when everyone else was making excuses. But in saving 5 young draconians from a burning station, they had awakened something much larger than themselves. The sanctuary's call hadn't just summoned ships to a battle. It had reminded the galaxy of what they could achieve when they worked together towards something greater than their individual survival. "Captain," Keth spoke up, his scales now bearing the deep blue patterns of a scholar, "the Council has approved our request. The 5 of us are going to be the first students in the new Interspecies Academy. We'll be learning from teachers of every race, studying everything from quantum mechanics to comparative philosophy." Sarah felt a warm glow of pride and satisfaction. These 5 younglings would grow up to be bridges between their peoples, living proof that the galaxy's different species could not only coexist, but thrive together. "And you, Captain?" Zara asked. "What will you do now that the station is rebuilt?" Sarah looked out at the stars, at the ships moving between them, carrying trade and friendship instead of weapons and conquest. The galaxy was changing, growing into something the precursors had hoped it could become. And humanity, the species that ran toward danger when others ran away, would continue to be guardians of that hope. "I think I'll keep doing what humans have always done," Sarah said with a smile. "I'll stand watch, make sure the innocent stay protected, and be ready to say no when evil comes calling again." Through the observation deck speakers came the sound of young voices, laughing, draconian and human children playing, together in the station's recreation areas, growing up in a galaxy where their species were allies instead of strangers. It was the sound of the future the sanctuary had called into being, built on the foundation of a single human woman's refusal to abandon 5 frightened younglings when the universe was burning around them. The dragon's den had been burning, but she had carried them out alive in her arms. And in doing so, she had helped kindle a fire that would burn across the galaxy for generations to come. The fire of hope, of courage, and of the unshakable human conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice. The stars stretched out before them, no longer cold and hostile, but warm with the promise of what they could build together. And somewhere among those stars, ancient precursor mechanisms hummed with satisfaction, their long vigil finally rewarded by the sight of younger races choosing compassion over conquest, unity over division. The future was bright with possibility, and humanity would be there to help guard its flame.